With all of that said, it's important to acknowledge that questions of media power don't go away just because audiences imagine them away. We still live in a world of redoubtable power differentials, and nowhere is that clearer than with regard to gender. But one of the things we do see is that studies of women audiences allows us to reflect on the enduring themes regarding media, power, and society that have changed, but also in some senses remained the same since media research began. So I'm going to be thinking about representations of women and the way that women interact with media in a way that kind of allows us to think about how what appear to be small scale qualitative method research studies on niche audiences reflect some larger issues. And in particular, I want to be connecting the what appears to be quite a boutique piece of research on scrapbooking to broader themes in media research. So, what we're really dealing with here is that qualitative audience research is something that allows us to explore the connections between media and social consciousness. Sometimes there are connections between how we live in the world and how we use media, and that quite often it's not uncommon for us to use media stories as a kind of as a point of reflection to think about where we fit into the world. Um, and this is one of the places, as we've seen through the concept of resistance, where we can begin to imagine different worlds. But on another level, it's important to recognize that in some ways, these acts of resistance actually deepen our dependence on media. That is, that again, if we go back to our religious metaphor, we've seen the argument that media really don't care what we do with their stuff as long as we keep using it. What we need to think about also is kind of this interesting interplay whereby media industries profit from our attention, even when we're doing apparently subversive things with the content that they make. And one of the examples that I think is super interesting at the moment is Meghan Markle. The Duchess of wherever she's the Duchess of Sussex, I guess. The Who married Prince Harry, and as we know, they've infamously um, effectively resigned from the royal family. And it's the first time that's really happened since 1936. But for the first time it's happened in the in the modern media era, and certainly there's a compelling media angle to this particular story. But one of the things that we would see is that Meghan Markle is the sort of female media figure that's figured extensively in the history of female audiences, in that she's an interesting character who we can connect to all kinds of themes that really matter about how power works in the real world, particularly around not only gender but of course race is a massive one. And the question of whether Meghan Markle has been, I suppose, subjected to intense, unfair media and social criticism because she's everything that a royal bride is not supposed to be. She's divorced, she's American, and she's biracial. Oh my goodness! And all of these things make her unusual as a royal wife, and it's argued with I would say some justification that these things have meant that she's been subjected to particularly vicious public scrutiny. But the most interesting thing I think about Meghan Markle and Prince Harry is the way that they've turned this into media capital. So one of the things that we see is that they're turning all of this attention into forging careers for themselves as media entrepreneurs. I think the latest story is a series on Netflix. But what we see is the way that media industries profit from all of this sort of attention, because on the one hand, we're seeing some really serious discussions about the nature of power, the nature of gender, the nature of prejudice when it relates to the royal family. And of course, when you're talking about when it relates to the royal family, you're talking also about how it relates to society, to British society, and to the power differentials, the power relationships that make that society up. And it draws attention to the existence of racism in British society. It draws attention to the existence of global sexism. All of these really, really super important ideas. But it seems that perhaps the people who are going to profit from this most are is Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, as they churn all of this back into a media career that is, by some estimates, could see them turned into billionaires. So it's all good, as they would say, or it's all grist for the mill, as Marx would say. Um, but anyway, what we see is, and we've seen lots of people rush to Meghan Markle's defense, criticize her, so on and so forth. But what we can say is that here's an example of how a narrative about Meghan Markle that encompasses TV drama, celebrity industry, all of these sorts of things, relates very directly to really important debates gender and the world and racism and all of those sorts of things. And we can make an argument that when women are deciding what they think about Meghan Markle, they're not only thinking, what do I think about Meghan Markle? They're also thinking about, well, what do I think about gender inequality? What do I think about racial inequality? So on and so forth. And where can you find people talking about these things? That's one of the reasons why I selected the reading from this week. So, if we go all the way back to the early part of the 20th century, you could see young women talking about or thinking about exactly the same things, except they weren't sitting down and thinking about things in sort of in terms of presenting a political argument. They were keeping scrapbooks. They were taking elements of media content, literally cutting them up and pasting them together again to tell their own stories about gender in the media. And one of the things we see from the reading this week is that these scrapbooks end up being fascinating historical evidence about how people in the early part of the 20th century thought about gender through the film industry. And this idea of scrapbooking represents is an example of the sorts of creative method that one might use in exploring what media audiences think about the media messages that they see and how those media messages play a role in those socializations. We're not just talking about scrapbooking, we're talking about interviewing, we're talking about keeping media diaries. We could talk about various forms of digital scrapbooking, digital curation, the use of Pinterest, these sorts of things. So what we can see is that although the reading from this week concerns historical records of things that were happening in the 1920s, they and in fact earlier, they very much relate to contemporary issues about how media industries use various devices to encourage attention and to get people to collaborate with them, to get people to participate with them, but also the ways that people sometimes find their own political voice and their own reflections on socialization in the act of doing something as apparently innocuous as keeping a scrapbook about your favorite star. So have a think about how you can think about those ideas and methods in your research, again, what we're seeing is that some of the questions that we ask about gender and media today aren't so different to the sorts of questions that scholars were asking 100 years ago. But in any case, the example of how women audiences make sense of stories about gender is an example of a really important kind of media influence, which is the way that media storytelling becomes a part of socialization.